Bristol in about 1850 was a rather sleepy coastal New England village. It had gone past its great days by that time of the great trading days and the whaling days, and a lot of the inhabitants were engaged in the trade. They were farmers, coastal fishermen, and coastal traders. The boys grew up not in the village proper, but they grew up in a rather secluded part of the town known as Papasquash Point. And a trip to town was a trip to town, and it was carefully chosen when people came here. And so the boys grew up in a kind of rural atmosphere, and they had the advantage of a father who was, as Bristol folks always termed it, a kind of country gentleman. And he had a great deal of time to spend away from the farm in aspects of pleasure. He did like to fish, and he did like to, above all, sail. And so they grew up in a household with a father who was oriented around the water. And I think from their earliest day, they saw their father in boats or building boats or having something to do with boats. And I would imagine he was their greatest inspiration. The boys were all involved in boating in one way or another from a very, very early time. Their father, Charles Frederick Herreshoff, had the added advantage of being very clever with his hands, and he did his boat work himself from the beginning to the end, and he was a man who began his boat building with half models. And so from their earliest time, the boys watched their father making half models, and then the boats would spring from these. And like many boys, I would imagine they very often play acted as youngsters at what their father was doing. As is the case with many boys, they play acted at what they saw their father doing, and I think this is a very normal thing to do. And Mr. Herreshoff built a number of boats, both for his own use and for the use of others while they lived at Papasquash Point, which was a very nice facility and a very nice home at that particular time. It had been originally built by a Tory whose name was Vassal, and the colonial government, of course, impounded the home at the time of the Revolution, and it was turned over to John Brown, the Providence merchant, who had helped so much with the cause of the Revolution as sort of payment for what he had done. And when Charles Frederick Herreshoff married John Brown's daughter, they went there to live. It must have been a very ideal and wonderful place. Even though removed from the town, it must have been an ideal place for boys to grow up. It had everything that boys are enchanted with. Close to the water, and woods and fields, and just a magnificent place.
Were there any other?
I think when they finally came to town, they had an opportunity and a distinct advantage at that time. Bristol had been a center of the boat building industry for many, many years. And in 1850, many of those expert old craftsmen were still here and still working. And Mr. Herreshoff Sr., of course, was acquainted with a number of these men, and his boys, of course, had the advantage of, therefore, knowing them as well. And I think at a very early age, they began to become interested in this kind of work. John, for instance, when the family moved to town, John managed to become very friendly with a machinist at the Namquit Mill, which has down hard on the harbor at Thames Street. And he became a regular visitor to the machine shop, and the machinist liked John very well and showed him all sorts of things, which of course he transferred to his own machine shop when he was a youngster. Captain Nat very often made reference, I know, whenever some work was being done, he would very often make reference to the way old Mr. So-and-so did it when he was a boy. So it's obvious that they paid a great deal of attention to these workmen, whether it was old Mr. Manchester who worked on boats on Thames Street, or John Monroe, who was the town pump maker, or whatever. They were very, very interested in this kind of work, and they obviously observed and learned very well.
Could you talk a little bit about how, yeah, that's basically
it. The history of the Browns is somewhat colorful, but the Brown family became very wealthy through shipping and the trades, and really it was because of the Brown business, I guess, that everything started here. When Carl Friedrich Herreshoff arrived in this country from Germany, he went to work for one of the Brown shipping interests in New York City, and then he was later transferred, as I understand it, to Providence. And it was here, of course, that he met and fell in love with John Brown's daughter, and they were ultimately married and inherited the property at Poppasquash that John Brown had come into.
Okay, I'd like for you to talk a little.
John's early business enterprises were really quite remarkable. He showed at a very, very early age an interest in business and in making money. I think as early as about the time he was 8 or 9 years old, he had an enterprise in growing vegetables and selling them to the people in Bristol. He grew onions and all that sort of thing that was typical in Bristol at that time. When the family eventually moved to the village and lived here at the Herreshoff property close by the shore, he had a garden here as well, and he was a great trader. He would trade vegetables for goods and then trade those goods for other goods. He built a rope walk, which I understand was about 240 feet long, with the help of his father, and laid up rope, which he offered up for sale. He was tremendously interested in watches all of his life, and in his early days he had quite an enterprise in fixing and selling watches to townspeople. John was one of 4 members of his generation who was blind. There were 9 children, and 4 experienced adult life unsighted. John developed glaucoma in one of his eyes at the age of 7. However, this didn't impede him in anything that he did, and he continued on in his interest, particularly of working in his shop and working on boats and that sort of thing, with the sight of the good eye. Just around the time of his 15th birthday, he was frolicking with his brother Charles, and accidentally struck himself in the good eye with a stick. And from that point on, he was totally blind, from the age of 15 on. Up to that time, he had somewhat, a good use of the eye. Well, it must. I don't know. This is speculation, of course. I could only assume that it must have been absolutely devastating at that particular time period. 15 for a boy is a crucial time period psychologically. There are all of these things coming down on adolescent boys, and to be stricken this way must have been absolutely devastating to him. The various accounts say that he did eventually cope with it, and remarkably, it seems he spent some time in retirement, but ultimately he overcame all of this. The will that he had to participate in life is perfectly obvious in all of this. A strong young man, and obviously put his head together properly in a rather short period of time.
Yeah, I think it's.
He was educated as the children were early in their lives, as I understand it, by Mrs. Herreshoff, who was a well-educated woman, and then ultimately they were enrolled in the Bristol public schools. They were educated in the local schools. In fact, I think one of the reasons that they moved from Pappasquash in 1856 to the village, in part, was in consideration of the education of the youngsters, because that trip from the farm at Point Pleasant was a long one, and I know the boys had reminiscences of walking as well, getting picked up by a wagon with someone who was going around the head of the harbor and that sort of thing. But I think one of the considerations for their coming here and leaving that wonderful farm at Point Pleasant was because of the children. So they did come here to the village, and Mr. Herreshoff obtained the property that's known as the Lemuel C. Richmond property, and as luck would have it, it was right on the shore and had a wharf and a building close on the shoreline, and he could continue his associations with Bristol Harbor as he always had. I think as you talk about the personality of John B. Herreshoff, there's an interesting anecdote that during the time he was in the Bristol schools, like many young boys, he liked to joke and fool and so on. And his desk was close to the blackboard, and it was in the front and in the corner. And when children were called to recite, they very often waited their turns by sitting on the corner of his desk. And over the course of time, he bored a fine hole through the desk, and then made an arrangement with a needle and a wooden spring, which he could activate whenever he wanted to. And there was a young lady who sat on his desk one day, and he tested his spring-loaded needle on her. It worked. He never had an opportunity to try it again, but it shows a side of his nature that he was a bit frivolous at times. He strictly wasn't the hard-nosed businessman concentrating always on his work.
But he utilized his growing up.
Nat's childhood, of course, mirrored in the early days exactly his brother's childhood. Of course, they shared that. They were apart in years. Nat was about 7. Is this on the hour?
No.
Oh. Uh, I'll start back with Nat was 7 years younger than his brother John, and somewhat of a significant age difference, I imagine, amongst brothers growing up. It's hard for me to say. I was an only child, and I don't fully understand that. Although I have two sons, and they're spread apart by about 4 years, and it's become somewhat obvious in that kind of setup that one brother is far more advanced in years and begins to have other interests. With regard to Nat and John, I think that's easy enough to speculate. When John lost his eyesight, the little brother, who obviously didn't have a terrible lot of influence in his life, became extremely important. I think at the time of John being blinded and then having the desire to work, Nat became his eyes, and in Captain Nat's memoirs, he recollects that through his own desire to help his brother and going along with his parents' agreement that it would be justified, he, at about the age of 8 or 9, began to do things that other boys of that age never, ever would do. And in a sense, when anyone asks about Captain Nat's childhood, I very often think, maybe it wasn't much of a childhood. He did devote a great deal of his time to what I would call more adult pursuits. He probably learned at an early age what some men learn when they're 18, 19, 20, as far as working with tools is concerned, and getting out products that were done in John's machine shop on his lathes and that kind of thing. But whether or not this had a tremendous influence on Nat, I don't know. All I could say is I wonder if John had not been blind and had not required Nat's assistance, if Nat would have had the interest. I suspect that he would. A genius is a genius, and given certain talents, as Nat Herreshoff had, he probably would have gone the way he had. I think mainly, that parental influence was very strong. I think I've lost the thread of the question now.
Well, what happened back then related to the success of the company.
Well, I think that the company was a definite success. That's a given for a variety of reasons, chief among which is the fact that the company had the benefit of probably what was the ideal business partnership. And John had his great strength in finances, and the ability remarkable ability for a man who is unsighted to keep the economic side of the company in his head totally. And the benefit of this is that it relieved N.G. Herreshoff from even thinking about this, which maybe would have been a burden to his creative career. He was the creative one. He was the design genius, actually. And you couldn't ask for a better partnership in business. And each had his own area of expertise, and each had his area of concentration, and there was no crossing. And I think this made for a much better relationship, a harmonious relationship in business, because there was no competition between the brothers. Each had his own area of specialization. And probably this all goes back to the routine that began when they were boys.
Could you just say that over again without the banging in the background?
Yes, I don't know if as well as the fact that they probably had the finest workforce available to them at that particular time. I think at the time that John's business was started, a business that later became a partnership with his brother, he had available to him a number of artisans and craftsmen in the shipbuilding industry who were out of work and needed employment at a time that he could offer it. And he had the finest workmen. Captain Nat always claimed that he could in his later life could not begin business again without the help and assistance of the old-time craftsmen that he had when he started up.
Okay, that's...
They sailed together all the time. Their earliest sailing, of course, was with their father, who had a succession of very, very fine, fast catboats. But John and Nat sailed together as a team in a small boat called Meteor in the 1850s. And although I think it's certainly totally John's product, John, of course, could not sail alone without the assistance of his brother Nat. And Nat was at the tiller most of the time, receiving a lot of suggestions from John, as I understand it. But they were both very fine sailors. It's my understanding that John sailed occasionally himself, though unsighted, and could sail quite well to windward and had a definite feel for wind and feel of the tiller and that sort of thing. And he was also physically in extremely good shape and could rove halyards by shinnying up a mast and that sort of thing. But they began to sail together at a very, very early age, and they were in competition together at a very, very early age, and successfully in competition. It wasn't long before these two Herreshoff boys began to claim all sorts of honors. Their mother was extremely proud of what they had done, and she kept a scrapbook of news clippings of the various races they had entered and almost always won. They delighted in racing. They delighted in beating their father when they could, although sometimes he was particularly difficult to beat. He himself was a great sailor and a good mentor for these boys. But they did indeed begin sailing very early, and of course their own sailing exploits, I think, were in part responsible for John establishing his business. When they became the boys to beat, obviously it was their product that was in large part responsible, and a lot of people wanted a product built by them. Nat's formal education was at the Bristol schools, and he completed a standard course and graduated from high school when he was about 17 or 18 years of age. His education continued at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he was enrolled in a special course in engineering that lasted 3 years. And at the end of this time period, I would say that his 3 years at MIT were three very distinguished years. It was quite obvious that he was, when he left, an accomplished engineer. And he took employment at a formidable steam engineering works in Providence, Rhode Island, the Corliss Manufacturing Company. He didn't break all ties with his family at Bristol during that time. However, he continued to do some work for his brother John when he was there at Corliss. He was in charge of setting up a massive Corliss steam engine in Philadelphia at the time of the Philadelphia Exposition, and it took him to Philadelphia for 2 or maybe 3 weeks for the setup, and ultimately the startup, which is a very, very famous thing of the president starting up that steam engine. Captain Nat had arranged for all of that. I guess it was quite an important epoch in his life, and he did keep in his possession throughout his life, I believe in the model room, a picture of that Corliss steam engine, which we have at the museum now, his own copy of the Centennial engine, which was a masterpiece of setting up, actually.
It's quite an honor for works jobs at that time.
I would imagine that the Corliss company had a great deal of confidence in him to send him to do this. It must have been a tremendously important job, because at this particular time, 1876, the country was absolutely jubilant with this celebration, and everyone went to Philadelphia, and the simple thought of having this engine fail or not go together as it was supposed to must have been a great deal of pressure on the company itself, and to choose a young engineer to do it certainly is obviously a tribute to Captain Nat's engineering background, and I suppose a tribute to MIT as well. John started building boats here on the town side of the harbor about the time of the early years of the Civil War, and although in the beginning he built small boats, after a time he was able to obtain the use of the old tannery building that was on the shore and was, of course, his parents' property, and then engaged first one, then several workmen to assist in these orders that he would get, mainly for boats for the fishing industry, for the Menhaden and Pogie industry in the bay. But then he went on from there. But he started, I would say that he started in the early years of the Civil War, 1860, 61, and then went on from there. I think we date the start of the actual building of boats here at 1863, and it was about that time, I suppose, that he took on employees, but prior to that it was a speculative kind of work and with the help of his father. So officially 1863 is when he started, and it grew to a point where he ultimately took on a partner, Dexter Stone, in a rather short-lived partnership of about a year, and which is in direct contrast to the partnership which he had with his brother for such a long period of time, 1878 to 1915.
What were the circumstances that brought the two brothers together to form the partnership?
John needed Nat. There was no question about that. In Nat's spare time, and on weekends, all the time he was at Corliss, he had been designing for John. And John had tried to get Nat to come with him for a period of years and was somewhat unsuccessful at this, not intent on pursuing this engineering career. Nat was at this particular time more interested in steam engines and boilers than in anything else. And his coming with John certainly would mean that he would have to give some of this up. It would also mean, I think, that he would take a reduction in his pay, a slight reduction, but nonetheless a reduction. I think he was reluctant to come in the beginning, but I think John probably painted a rosy picture of the future, and he and Nat reached a gentleman's agreement about his coming here, which he did at the beginning of the new year in 1878. And they together formed what we now know as the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company at that time. It was, John B. Herreshoff Boat Builder and Herreshoff and Stone Boat Builders, but the actual date of the brothers' partnership is the first of the year in 1878.
Do you know?
Yes. The gentleman's agreement, never a verbal agreement, not on paper, was that they would do the best work that they possibly could with money that they had earned. That's the crux of the agreement, that they would never speculate with others' money, but everything that they did would be from the profits of what they made, as Nat said, from their own good, honest work. And that's the agreement that they had verbally. John's responsibility, of course, is evident in his title of president of the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company. But I think he was far more than that. He was a remarkable man in many ways. The daily running of the works was more the responsibility of Nat than it was John. John had a great deal in his head with regard to whatever supplies they had available here, and certainly had a magnificent knowledge of cost and cost determination. And I think his major responsibility was cost estimation during much of the life of the company, number one, and public relations man, number two, and sort of going out and getting business, number three. Nat's work was here at the yard, supervising design and construction, and of course carrying through on all of the products of his own mind. Everything was generated from Nat's mind, which is a remarkable thing. The daily routine here would be something like this. Nat would arrive at the yard at about 9 a.m. and he would make a morning tour of the facility, and he would speak with John about what was going on, or new orders had come in, and that sort of thing. And in the afternoon, he virtually did the same thing, making a walking tour of the plant. And that was such a fine way to keep your hand on what was going on in the shop. He knew exactly what was going on, and virtually what every workman was doing. And he was able to make suggestions about the various products in the building going on that way. I really think that perhaps is one of the keys to the success of the company. They were able to to put out the finest product imaginable, because it was a project that had been attended to by the man who conceived it. At every single day he attended to his work. So
Through the...
to completion. From the initial inspiration to its completion, whether it was a special block or whether it was a cup defender. The concept began in his mind and slid down his ways, and he had his finger on it during the entire period.
That's a great...
The workmen at Herreshoff's were a fraternity in the old days, and not a workforce. Of all the aspects of the manufacturing company,
Let's wait a moment.
that's a short one, it's the first quarter. Of all the aspects of the manufacturing company, I think the workforce intrigues me more than anything else. Absolutely remarkable group of people. During the great heyday of the company, I think the workforce numbered just under 300 people. This would be in the late 80s and through the 90s. And it was not unheard of for a man to have worked here 40 years. It's known that one of the workmen worked here for 60 years. And of course it's very common to have father-son teams on the workforce here. That is very, very common. Working at Herreshoff's was prestigious for the workmen. And they were so attentive to their work, I think, because they first of all gloried in the product that they were building, and for the opportunity to work on so grand a scale, as many of them had gone back to the days of the building of the whaling boats here and that sort of thing, and then there was a slump. And now this was an opportunity to do what they did best. And especially, I think, they did their best because they were tremendously inclined to please N.G. Herreshoff. And I think in all of the reminiscences of the old employees, they have the highest regard for him and were especially pleased with some kind of word of acceptance of their own craftsmanship from him, which possibly didn't come often, but I think they knew when he was pleased. And generally coming out in their reminiscences, this desire to do their absolute best work, because they were all communally proud of what they'd done when the product was completed. I've heard a lot of the old-time workmen say, we complete a job and we just like to stand back and look at it and admire it and know it was the best that could be done at that particular time. I've lost the question. The employees who came here in the beginning were obviously of the finest. People like Edward Thompson and old Henry Sanford and some of the others. They were just the best in their areas, whether they were painters or sail makers or whatever. They were the best, and they respected each other. And one of the things that made the employees of this yard different from a lot of the yards of the time period is their absolute integrity and honesty. Many of them were related to each other. That's another interesting thing. and they were related by blood or by marriage. So-and-so's sister married this one, and that kind of thing. And they belonged, in those years, Bristol had a number of lodges, men's lodges, and there would be the Masons and the Odd Fellows and the fire department and that kind of thing. And so on various nights there would be these meetings, and you would find that, generally speaking, a lot of the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company employees all belonged to the same lodge. So if they weren't bonded by marriage or by
My teeth.
that's the tea kettle.
Think someone's gonna get that? Maybe right, Tom.
So a lot of the employees were lodge brothers, and if they weren't bonded by marriage or by blood, they were bonded by their lodge work, and above all by that even larger working fraternity that they had here. And I know that in many of the other boatyards it was impossible to leave your tools lying around at the end of a workday, and that was not the problem here. The men would leave for the night, leave their tools exactly where they left them, and there they'd be. And this would be over the weekend or whatever. There was never a problem with that. On rare occasion, I remember Tom Brightman telling me when he was a young employee here, once in a great while they would get a new employee here, and something would be missing, and one workman would say to the other, "Watch him," and the word would get to him very quickly, and he would be cured of that sort of thing. The men were very close. One of the things that always intrigued me is that when they had their day off on Sunday, they would very often, groups of them, would do things together, and they would walk to Mount Hope, and they really enjoyed each other's company, and I think it's a remarkable thing in a workforce. One of the things I've never heard of is John or anybody or any of the supervisors or foremen having to arbitrate in any kind of disputes. And another thing, they were paid very well. It's said that they were the highest paid boat builders in this area, and that may have created a tremendous degree of harmony in the workforce as well. But they knew each other. They knew what they were doing, and they absolutely took pride in what they did. In 1903, the local Phoenix put out quite a nice magazine supplement called Beautiful Bristol, and there was a wonderful segment to do with the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company, and one of the best pictures is a group of the old-time employees, and they're absolutely ancient. They worked here forever. There was, I guess, as long as you could do it, you worked on and took great pride. And it was a long working day. They began work about 7 o'clock and worked till noon, and had time to have their lunch, what we call lunch now, what was called dinner in Bristol then. And then they worked on from 1 to 6 o'clock, and sometimes later than that when there was a job that had to be done. They had good working quarters. There was no question about that. Good working quarters, light, airy, steam heat in the winter, gas lighting, that sort of thing. It must have been, for those old-time craftsmen, it must have been a wonderful, wonderful working life.
Well, it had to be a multi-generational thing.
It's very obvious. Tom Brightman came here, he told me, in 1901, and his father was employed here and had been employed here for years, and Tom came to initially as a young man to work in the office, and his first tasks were quite menial. He had to keep wood in the fireplace, you know, and that sort of thing. But then he grew and grew and grew, and ultimately, of course, he had very high supervisory function when the company ended in 1945. He stayed right from 1901 to 45, 44 years of service, and only stopping because the company ended. That was it. And Nathaniel married Clara DeWolf in 1883 and had built for his residence a very, very fine home, which still stands at the Love Rocks, which is in just off Hope Street. And I really don't know what to say about his marriage. There's so much speculation on it. But I would say that Mrs. Herreshoff was a very kind and loving wife, and above all, she must have been an extremely understanding woman. It's probably terribly difficult to be married to a genius, but I guess she had known him all his life, and she wasn't stepping into a marriage blind, and she knew that his working day was indeed longer than most men in the town, and this seemed to be perfectly agreeable. They had a number of children, and let's see, I guess they had, I've got to stop and count on this one. Let's see, Agnes and Sydney and Frances and Gid, Agnes, Sydney, Gid, Frances, Clarence. I guess 5 children, 4 boys and a girl. They had 5 children, all very accomplished in their own right, and all with fond memories of their mother when they were growing up. The house was particularly suited, I think, to particularly for the boys to engage in all sorts of sports when they were growing up, and they all had fond memories of sailing and rowing and swimming and ice boating, particularly in those cold Bristol winters. And I think indeed it was a very happy household. I don't know if Captain Nat spent a great deal of time, as his work day was very ordered, but I think that in the early hours of the morning, from about 6:30 to about 8 o'clock, he did some work in his model room, and then he had breakfast at 8, and then came to the shop, as he called it, at 9, which was property that bordered his own, so he just walked to it, stayed here till 12, and went home and ate, and very often read from the technical magazines of the day after he had had his noonday meal, and maybe had a nap, and then came back to the shop again and stayed on until till 6. Did a little more work in the evening, sometimes well into the late hours in his model home. So he had a particularly, this is great. That's it. Nat had a very orderly life in light of the fact that he seemed to have a regular routine every single day, and he ate his meals at the same time every day, which some people tell me is very conducive to good health. And he had another advantage, his son Clarence always told me, of having all of his life the best food and very healthy food. And he avoided stimulants. I was surprised to learn that he never drank coffee or tea or alcohol. I think on one occasion he had a taste of whiskey, so they say, and didn't like it. But he was very much had the advantage of a very good life that way. He loved Johnny cakes, they tell me, and he had Johnny cakes 6/7 of the week for his morning breakfast, and on Sunday he had something different for a change. But I'm devoted to Johnny cakes myself, and I think they're very helpful kind of food. So he did indeed have a very orderly life at home. I think with his work at the shop, having a wife who was very much in charge of the home relieved him of worries about that sort of thing. I don't know a great deal about John's home life. On the other hand, when he was first married, he lived with his parents for a period of time, and then ultimately built his own home on Burnside Street, lived on High Street for briefly before he built his last home there. John had but a single child, a very capable young lady who was interested in photography and to whom we are indebted for chronicling the family business over a period of years with her fine photographs. John, of course, had to endure the severe social stigma of the time of being a divorced man. And the whole case of the divorce is interesting and somewhat cloudy because of the social stigma of the time, with a lot of people not wanting to talk about it. Family members, particularly on John's side of the family, were always quite tight-lipped about the thing. It seems he tried to obtain a divorce from his first wife, known to the family as Sadie. Her name was Sarah Lucas Kilton, and she came from Boston, as Captain Nat's and John's mother did as well. But it seems as though John tried for divorce unsuccessfully over a period of years, even going out west to try to obtain one there in an easy manner, and it was somewhat difficult. I would suspect that after a time Mrs. Herreshoff was just worn down with litigation and ultimately consented to a divorce. Interestingly, it was granted to him on the grounds that she provided him with inadequate care, and I suppose what they would call today in the current jargon of mental cruelty. But I don't know if really I could see through all of that. At the time of the impending divorce, the subject was detailed in some of the New York gossip papers, and one called the Town Tattler of 1899 used the front page for the story of the Herreshoff divorce. They never named him, but they referred to the blind boat builder of New England, and there was no doubt that there was only one. And they took certainly Mrs. Herreshoff's side and said that she was a very patient woman, having forgiven him a number of indiscretions during their married life together, and indicated that this lady's man had gone off a number of times with certain flamboyant females, and in a contrite way had come back and been taken back. So the end of the matter is he was granted a divorce and did marry a second time, and lived in a very, very fine house at the head of the manufacturing street and close by his business. He was devoted to his daughter, and she accompanied him on his trips and travels, whether it was buying trips or recreational and pleasure trips to Europe, or just ordinary daily life around here. She had two daughters herself, and J.B. in the latter part of his life was quite devoted to these little girls. They were all born near the turn of the century, so he did have an opportunity to have contact with these children. And I think both brothers share a kind of affectionate relationship with their grandchildren in their later years.
Could you talk? I guess the Sunday boating trips.
John's recreation, interestingly, involved land transportation as well as water transportation. I think Nat's recreation was limited to the water, as we might expect. John certainly enjoyed his Sundays and his weekends and his trips on the water in a variety of steam yachts that he owned, and certainly he enjoyed being in sailing boats himself. And his entire lifetime, I think he was on the water in some way or another for recreational activity. But he also liked horses, and he liked fast horses, and he spent a good deal of money on horses and the equipage that went with it. He had very fine carriages and very fine sleighs. Interestingly, I was reminiscing earlier about his love of coasting in sleds when he was a child. And as he matured, this interest matured as well, and he became the owner of a very fine sleigh called a cutter. And Bristol gentlemen in those days very often raced when the conditions were right on Hope Street. And about 100 years ago, this was a very popular sport, prearranged meetings, and off they would race with their fast horses. And of course John couldn't race himself, but he was a passenger in the sleigh with his coachman. The Bristol Phoenix runs a column each week when it comes out called 100 Years Ago, and they go back into their files and they tell you what was going on that week 100 years ago. And this past winter they ran a number of stories about John Herreshoff being a winner in the sleigh races on Hope Street on certain Sunday afternoons and that kind of thing. So he enjoyed that. I would imagine that was for his own personal recreation and not so much that of his family. When we see the family photograph albums of the yachting trips, certainly they're all there, and he's surrounded by family and friends and what seems to be always a very convivial atmosphere, people playing music, and Mrs. Herreshoff playing the mandolin or something like that, and all having a good time. But the sleigh racing, I would imagine, was a personal recreation. He also liked driving in the carriage with his coachman and going off into the as far as the Berkshire Hills, I understand, at one time. He transferred his love his love of speed to fast horses, to the motor car after the turn of the century. And he was an owner of a number of very fast and very fine automobiles, large automobiles like Stevens Duryers and Premiers and that kind of thing, and even advertised for one auto company in Connecticut that used an engine that was inspired by the Herreshoff engineering, the compound. And his recreation, I would imagine, on the water was very similar to the recreation that the NG family had as well. NG Herreshoff and his family enjoyed innumerable fine weekends. That's the half hour, isn't it?
No.
No, it's 3/4?
3/4.
Yeah. N.G. Herreshoff and his family enjoyed numerous fine weekends on the steam yachts, of course, and of course on the sailing vessels. When he was first married, he and his wife Clara enjoyed sailing together a good deal of the time. And later, when the children came, they would all be together. But I think he liked picnics a great deal, and he was an aficionado of the clam bake. And I think if you asked Captain Nat what his favorite meal was, he probably would say he liked clam bakes. He seemed to have the opportunity to attend a number of them during the summertime at Patience Island and Prudence Island and various places where they would stop off. Well, he more often than not had someone with him, whether it was someone in his employ or some member of his family. He was acquainted with the area of his home and the shop, of course, and could walk unassisted around the facility to a degree. He never walked unassisted on the wharfs and places like that. I think he had an uncanny sense about things. He walked with a stick, and of course that assisted him in not bumping into things and so on. The stick was graduated with notches so that he could also use it as a kind of ruler or yardstick when that was necessary. He was assisted by members of the family. I remember very well hearing his granddaughter reminisce about how many times she assisted him and how she loved to do it because she liked to listen to his commentary as they went along. Not necessarily to her, but his commentary to the workmen that he met and spoke to. And she was a young lady at that time and found this all very interesting. Katie, I know, escorted him a good deal. But I think he was highly proficient. I suppose when one is sighted until the age of 15, I suppose you have a working knowledge and a remembrance of what things look like, and maybe this is a help as opposed to someone who is born unsighted and has no knowledge of that. But he seemed to get along. There's always the stories, you know, the people like to tell in town of his tripping over things and not being taken back by it, just getting up and you know, saying something humorous about it. And but I don't really know if those are all true or not. Shopkeepers always said that when he purchased things, he knew exactly what bill he was taking out of his billfold. But I know a lot of people know that he spent a great deal of time making sure he knew exactly what was in there and how they were placed, and whether the large denominations were toward the rear and the smaller ones first. That would be easy enough to do, I suppose. But one of the things about the Herreshoff story is that there is so much that is the Herreshoff legend, and based on all these stories that increase as time goes on. And there's so many people in Bristol who all have this vivid recollection of different things that John would do, and they're probably not based on fact at all. It would just be too much.
Well, I wonder how he was able to...
Absolutely, that intrigues me more than anything else. He could calculate, it's my understanding that he could calculate the price of something as complex as a gunboat for, say, the Spanish government in something like a half hour. And there's this story that I heard from a family member that he had gone somewhere to be interviewed by a government representative who was in the market for buying gunboats. And they wanted to know what it would cost after describing what they wanted and when they wanted it. And they asked him how much time would he need. And he said a half hour. And he went off by himself and made the calculation. I can't fathom that at all. It's just a phenomenal ability that he had. He carried a great deal in his head. It's my understanding, I heard once from Tom Brightman, who worked in the office, that very often J.B. Herreshoff would be called to the phone to speak to a customer, and he would rattle off prices of products like a walking, talking catalog, and he was always right. They never, the office employees never checked to see if he was correct or not, because they knew he was correct. Had this phenomenal ability. I often think, I wonder what he would have been if he had been sighted. Would he have gone off into the area of design as his brother did and lost the company all this great financial input that he eventually gave it? I don't know. Phenomenal head for this. I just can't fathom it at all. But obviously he had the ability. There's no question that he was able to calculate these things in his head.
I wonder if it was enhanced by his blindness.
I often think of that. The idea that he was undisturbed by anything and really could concentrate.
You hear that some people say...
I don't think that there is a model, a half model, built by NGH that was not scrutinized by the sensitive fingers of J.B. Herreshoff before it was built.
Do you think that that helped him in estimating the cost of the boat, or he was just curious on what his brother was doing?
No, I think that he had enough knowledge of yacht design that the only way he could see it was to touch it, and that's how he knew what it was going to be like. I think he was extremely knowledgeable with regard to a yacht's lines and that sort of thing. But how could he see this on paper or anything? The half model was the way. The great confidence he must have had in his brother Nat. And I think that confidence that confidence grew out of their youthful relationship. There's no question in my mind that the partnership couldn't have worked any other way. It just developed out of this youthful reliance, and ultimately, I think, I don't think John ever questioned any of Nat's concepts. I don't think he did. After time, I just think, he knew. This is the question that everyone wants to know about, and if ever the conversation of the end of John's career comes up, everyone always wants to know about what happened in 1915. And there are two people who know exactly what happened. John is one, and NG is the other. And as far as I know, and I've researched this extensively, nothing was ever said on either side. And I particularly made a point of asking at various times JB's granddaughters, both Louise DeWolf and Catherine, about this. And they said they never heard anything about it. Whether or not this is true, I don't know. I do know the facts of this all. When this occurred, this argument, if we could call it that, this argument about the torpedo boats for the Russian government in 1915 occurred, as I understand it, in this way. Captain Nat had experienced ill health in about this time period, and he had received medical treatment for this help, and he had been to a hospital in New York, I think it was, and he was given a period of time to recuperate, and he recuperated in the warmer areas, and he liked Bermuda and had been there a number of times, and he spent time there. On his return from Bermuda, he discovered, of course, that things had begun to gear up here at the yard with regard to a speculation order on building torpedo boats for the Russian government. And I do know he conferred with John on this matter. And we do know that John never returned to the yard after that conference, and that he ultimately died thereafter in July of 1915 of, I think, This will be a long time. That'll gear up now.
Is it gonna, yeah, but I don't think you said it, that we actually died of a heart attack or a dilation of the heart.
Did I get to that
No,
part?
no.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, and the facts as we know them are that they indeed had a conference, and that John left on that particular day and did not return. On July 20th, 1915, that same summer, he'd been feeling poorly, and he did die of acute dilation of the heart, according to the death certificate, a heart attack. And I know there's always the speculation, even Francis in his book speculates about having died of the result of the interview, died of a broken heart. Some people like to, of course, that's somewhat impossible. Interestingly, John Herreshoff had a terrible bout with typhoid fever about 1862, and there was some thought that he might not recover from that. And then in the 1870s, he had scarlet fever. And I'm not a medical person, but I would think that both of these bouts could have contributed to weakening his heart. But nonetheless, he died in 1915, and of course there was a tremendous void that was experienced in the company because of this, and Nat had to go on with the burden of trying to oversee those things that his brother did, because he could never find a suitable. There was no replacement for John. John was soul. He was one of a kind, and there would never be anybody that would ever suit Nat Herreshoff in that capacity. And the company struggled on until 1917, and then a decision was made to stop. And then the interested yachtsmen, mainly from the Resolute Syndicate, prevailed on Captain Nat to stay on as president, although he was inclined not to, but he did stay on for a period of time. And I think their hope was that they could get some war contracts, and this didn't come to pass. And then the early 20s saw somewhat of a post-war recession that didn't help anything, and by 1924 even that syndicate of enthusiastic folks was disheartened, and a decision was made to sell the place at auction. And it was purchased by a local man who wanted to see the name and the business continue, and so it did. He put over 20 years of new life into the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company. Now I've forgotten what the...
You're going to talk
When Nat returned from Bermuda to discover, of course, at that point that John was well into making some arrangements, financial and otherwise, for the building of Russian torpedo boats. He went into conference with his brother, and as I indicated earlier, there are only two people who know what was said. But my guess that Nat was reluctant to go in on this deal goes back to their original gentleman's agreement. They had agreed never ever to go into any kind of project unless they had the money available. We won't buy a tool unless we have the dollar in hand was the principle that guided the company from the beginning. But the Russian torpedo boat enterprise was one that required John to borrow money and to increase the yard to do this with regard to buildings and tools and workmen. And all this had to be money that was not money in hand. And the original agreement was that they would have the money in hand. Nat was a very conservative individual. Comparing the personalities of the two brothers, I think John was willing to take chances, and he speculated. John speculated in all sorts of things, in his finances and in property. He was a great property owner in Bristol and builder of apartments and hotels and that sort of thing. And Nat never engaged in that. He was far more conservative. And so I think I can safely say that what happened at that meeting, and I've said this in public a number of times at lectures on JB, when people invariably ask me, what happened at that meeting? And I think I can safely say that although I was not there, there's only... When people ask me what happened, I think I can safely say, although I was not there, knowing Captain Nat as I have from study, there is no way that he wanted to engage in any kind of speculation of that sort, and he probably would not agree to signing the contract, and they were a partnership. And JB needed his signature, and I assume that is the reason he wouldn't sign. This must have been devastating to John. I think John had an idea that this was really going to put them into a good position financially. It possibly may have. Certainly they didn't get any orders from the American government during the war, and possibly relying on trade from foreign governments. England had been a customer, and Russia certainly in the past, and others may have come in. But it's great to be a Monday morning quarterback in all of this. They never got a decent contract during the First World War at all.
Was that Russian contract was the only one where they would have bought?
Okay. Let me just think a minute now. Go ahead a few years. Yeah, I guess I just talked about the selling of the company a little while ago in 1924. In 1924, the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company continued on after the auction sale under the hands of the Haffenraffer family, and Captain Nat was very often consulted in an advisory capacity here, and still played a role in the life of the yard, and certainly knew a lot of what was going on here, particularly because his son Sidney stayed on as chief designer and engineer here at the yard. His time for relaxation, though, came after 1924, and I think the burden of the company was lifted from his shoulders at that point. And we see at that point his purchase of a number of yachts for his own personal sailing. We see him going to Florida through the 1920s and enjoying himself tremendously there, and having a great comradeship with Commodore Monroe down at Coconut Grove, and we see him certainly in following a new direction in his life from the point of view of enjoyment, but continuing on with his life's work throughout all of this, building magnificent models during this time period, full working models, and sailing models, which he and Commodore Munro sailed in Biscayne Bay and tried various innovations out on. We see that aspect of his life, but he continued to work in his Love Rock's model room through the 20s and through the 30s, and gave advice to a number of people, began to carry on a heavy correspondence with a variety of individuals on yachting subjects, and he had a tremendous capacity in those years for reminiscence. And I think the second Mrs. Herreshoff, I've heard nothing but fine things about her from the sons, particularly Clarence, who claimed that she is the individual who added many years to his father's life through her. She was a professional nurse, and she took care of him and saw that he got the right food and exercise. And I think she was particularly interested in his leisure hours. And it was Anne Roebuck Herreshoff who inspired him in 1933 to begin to write notes of his memoirs of his life and of his relationship with his brother John, by way of a newspaper article that appeared as a reminiscence of some old sailing experience in Providence, Jerry Angel's Clam Shack or something. And I guess that Mr. Herreshoff thought there were some things about the news article that he remembered, and some were accurate and some were not. And she inspired him, why don't you write about it? And that was the seed that grew into his recollections of his brother John and his early experience with John and the boats that he sailed in and that sort of thing. He entertained a number of people at his home at Love Rocks at that time period, and toward the end of his life in the mid-30s, of course, got to watch some of his grandchildren grow up close by and nearby, and provide for the last years of his life. He spent a good deal of time in bed. My understanding is that he suffered from low blood pressure, and he did achieve the age of 90 and was capable. To the end, his last days were spent largely in his bed, where he had an arrangement for a table, and he did some work there at that point, and even toward the end of his life made a number of things, drafting tools for his own sons to use. So he had a very full, very complete life.
When was it? When did he die?
He died in the summer of the early summer of 1938, and usually writers always deal with the final chapter of Captain Nat's life by saying, and lucky he did not live to see the great gale of September 21 that devastated his yard and so on. But in Captain Nat's lifetime, he survived a number of hurricanes, or gales as they call them earlier, and I don't think he would have been placed in any disorder by the hurricane of 1938. The shop certainly wasn't, although some of their buildings were wrecked a bit. They were soon put to rights, and manufacturing continued. I don't think it would have been a devastating end for him.
I think that's it.
Okay.
I think we've gone from A to Z.